Hello YouTube. Hi, my name is Mark, and this is Nixon Motorsports. This channel is all about motorsports, from racing to exotic cars and sometimes simulators. This video today, some of you might find this very interesting, so several have requested over the channel that I speak about the Formula 1000 race car, talk about its specifics and some details and so on. So with that, let's get into the video. We're going to talk about the Formula 1000 race car. Come on. So before I get into the video, a little bit of history on the Formula 1000 race car. And again, I'll be walking through and talking about a lot of the specifics of this Formula 1000 race car directly, okay? As far as I know, it was around 2006 when the first Formula 1000s came on the market. Now, I may be wrong. It could be earlier than that or other parts of the world. My days of racing the Toyota Atlantic, I had a Swift 08 and a Swift 14 years back, and I'll never forget that first time I saw a Formula 1000. I did not know what it was, and it was over in the paddock area, so I found myself walking over there out of interest, and I walked up to this thing and I thought in my mind, you know, that's a good looking race car. What is that thing? And as I got closer to it, I saw that it had a chain drive in the rear of the car, and I thought to myself, okay, that's kind of silly. Not sure about that. And then I looked in the cockpit area and I saw that it was a space frame or a tubular chassis. I kind of dismissed it, to be honest with you, at that point. I thought, you know, that's not really a proper race car. My Toyota Atlantics, as an example, I thought were, as just a comparison, you know, carbon monochrome chassis, you know, a purpose-built race car, right? So speed forward, years later, and of course, back then I had no idea someday I'd be racing a Formula 1000 myself. And I probably would have laughed if somebody told me that. But, you know, as I reflect back and think about that, you know, I'm way past that, by the way. The Formula 1000 race car is a great race car, but let me talk about the differences of why that is, just for you as a comparison. First, these cars, there were a few racers years ago, of course, around 2004, 5, in that range, who realized that the superbike motorcycle engines were awesome power plants, right? They were high revving, high horsepower, technically advanced, and the idea of putting a motorcycle powered engine like that in a race car intrigued obviously a few, and that, you know, in general terms, I think that's how the Formula 1000 started in the earlier days. The performance of these cars is fantastic for the price, but ultimately, why do I now really enjoy the Formula 1000? So I think about the Swifts, the 14s, the 08s. I had a Renard, you know, a Champ car, those type of cars, carbon monochrome chassis, you know, purpose-built or a race package that was very defined by racing rules, to be specific motor, to be specific gearbox, specific aero wings, and on and on and on. You're not able to really adjust, tune, develop those cars like I like to, for an example. Tune's the wrong word. Of course you can tune them, but from a tinker point of view, the one thing that is really, really cool about a Formula 1000 is you're able to actually evolve and develop the car over time. You know, so as I pan down here, and again, I'll get into the specifics of this Formula 1000 in a minute. This is a 2007 base chassis itself. It has a 2021 ZX-10R motor in it. As just one example, so it's more of an open development class. You can put whatever engine you want in the car. There's no rule around it has to be this manufacturer or this year. you know, any of those types of things, different brakes, different aero. That is the fundamental reason why I like the Formula 1000. It allows you to continuously develop the race car, modernize it, and so on, and be very, very competitive. So that's the basic history, and then why I think the Formula 1000 is cool. So this is a 2007 Store is the manufacturer, Formula 1000 race car. Okay, and again, I'm going to get into a lot of specifics here, talk about from the rear through the front of the car, talk about the power plant, and on and on and on. So just my perspective from the various different manufacturers. So Store was a big name in F1000. They've shipped a lot of cars over to Australia, I know, as an example. I picked the Store because I thought it looked great. So I'll just say this. When I select race cars, they have to be, they got to sound great, they got to go fast, they got to be strong performers. You know, visually they need to look good as well, right? So that's why I selected the Store in the first place. Now I've raced against, there's another manufacturer called Furman. I've raced against a couple Furmans over the years past. Very strong cars, in the right hands, the right driver, very, very fast. So Furman's, I've seen some positive things. Phoenix is another one, pretty limited number. I think they only had a few of the Phoenixes out there, pretty decent car. JDR is another one out there. A lot of success has been around the JDR car itself. And, you know, this may come off wrong to a few of you who love the JDRs. I would never own one. Look, they're fast, they're very light, so that's a positive. Lots of championships, as I said, have been won with the JDRs. I just find them visually unappealing myself. I would never own one just for that reason. And, you know, throw darts at me if you will, but that's my 2 cents on that particular car. So first, let's start with this. I think talking about the F1000, the performance of the vehicle, is probably a good place to start, right? Many people ask those type of questions. So first thing off top of mind, top speed. So many will ask, well, what's the top speed of a Formula 1000? You know, look, it depends, right? Depends on the track, it depends on the conditions, the setup, how trimmed out the car is, how much downforce, that type of thing. Roughly top speeds of about 160 miles an hour is available for the F1000. Now I typically will hit on the longer tracks up to about 150 miles an hour myself, but just to give you kind of a reference on that. So now let's talk about performance in G's, right? The ability for the car to brake and the ability for the car to get through the corners. So lat cornering capability, so lat G's of the Formula 1000 is 3 or 3 plus slightly G's. That's left to right turning. That's a lot. So you know, there's that performance specific. Now, from a braking point of view, pretty impressive as well, about 3 G's in braking performance, which is a lot. So that's 3 times your body weight, right? Now, these cars do have wings. They do not have ground effects or inverted wings on the bottom of the car. They're flat bottom, but they still produce about 1,100 pounds of downforce. For a car that weighs 1,000 pounds with driver, that's actually pretty good. So that's kind of the quick rundown of the big performance specifics that you may have interest in. All right, so specifics of the F1000. So first of all, by rule in design, it is not a carbon monochrome chassis. So the F1000 race car is a still or called space frame tubular chassis, and it does not use carbon fiber throughout the race car. It has fiberglass, you know, honeycomb, but fiberglass throughout the race car. The only exception is the nose, the crash structure, if I pan down here to the car. So this section here can be different, but you know, the rest of the body panels, the rest of the car, the floor, all of those items are fiberglass only by rules, right? The wheelbase of the F1000, it's about 99 inches, I think it is, or 100 inches. The front track is about 64 inches, and the rear track width is 61 inches, okay? Now, it's called an F1000 for two reasons. One, the minimum weight of the race car is 1,000 pounds. Actually, in my class specifically, it's 1,025, right? But the bulk of the cars, it's 1,000 pounds. Now that's with driver, so that's with driver in the car, that's, you know, fuel, fluids, and so on, okay? The second reason is it has a maximum of 1,000 cc's, and it has to be a motorcycle engine. It cannot be anything else. So 1,000 cc motorcycle engine in a space frame tubular chassis, 1,000 pounds minimum. That is the F1000. Now, the race car does have a fuel cell behind the driver's seat. There is a firewall. The fuel cell does have to be in the race car, and it's a 10-gallon maximum for the fuel cell. So let me talk about suspension a little bit. This is a double wishbone A-arm suspension on the race car. And you can see you have your upper here, you have your lower here, and you have a push rod. And so that is how you connect each corner of the race car. So there's one side of the front, here's the other front side. If I roll back here to the back, you can see the back suspension as well. So here you have an upper A-arm, again a lower A-arm. That happens to be the drive shaft here, but here's the push rod itself for the suspension. Now the suspension, of course, has to connect the tires and such. Here, let me go to the forward side to it, and it does so by what's called uprights. And so these uprights here connect to your suspension mounting points, and that's where your wheel, in this case, with a single nut, actually will attach to the suspension itself. Now the wheels have to be 13-inch. That is one requirement. You are able to run tires up to 10 inches front and rear. So in this example, I have a 7-inch, roughly 7-inch tire on the front of the car. Again, I could go wider, and I do, but that's just one example. If I roll here to the back, here's a 8.2-inch tire in the back. And so this is an example of what I'll run frequently with kind of a medium width tire, front and rear. And you might ask, well, why do that? Well, more tire requires more energy, slightly different setup. It does add weight, and it adds drag to the car. If you think about it, a wider footprint pushing through air does cause resistance, right? So that's one thing you have to think about. But if I pan over here, you can see here's a couple other sets of tires. These are wider. So this is an 8-inch front, and here's a 10-inch rear set of tires that I run on the race car, okay? Okay, let me pan down here to the bodywork on the race car. Now, there are many versions. Again, this car is a store, though the bodywork and many parts on it are upgraded and not original equipment, right? But per rules, the entire car bodywork and such has to be fiberglass. You're not able to use carbon fiber throughout the race car. There is one exception to that, and that is here, the nose itself, this crash structure, that can and typically is a Kevlar or carbon for the crash structure. But everything else, you know, wings, under tray, floor, side pods, engine cover, everything else is fiberglass. So as I've mentioned, so this car is manufactured by Store. And I've also mentioned how I love the F1000 for the reason that it's an open development class for the most part, right? Where you can continuously develop and evolve the race car. So as I pan down here and look at this particular race car, Store is the original race car, but very few bits and pieces on this car are actually from Store originally. Now, if I can point out the major items. So the chassis itself, the space frame, the metal structure, front to bulkhead is original equipment. Now the spar here in the rear end of the car is not, but that original space frame is. The suspension is also original equipment. So these A-arms, top and bottom, the push rods, the uprights, those are all original equipment. Pretty much everything else is upgraded, is new, replaced over time. So I use a lot of BRD body panels and parts and pieces. I use HRP for a lot of the wings, front and rear. So there are many manufacturers out there that will do these things for you. And these new HRP wings, as I roll down here to the back, you know, they're a pretty trick wing, right? They got really nice curvature, little bits and pieces on them. Pretty effective wings, but that's it. So very, very little on this car is a Store. So let me talk about electronics a little bit on the F1000. Now, rules do not define that you have loggers or electronics. Some of the previous dated rules for the F1000 required that you had to run the OEM or the stock engine ECU as an example. That's changed since 2018. So the ECU is one example. So in electronics, it's wide open now. So you're going to find many different versions out there. A lot of the racers, a lot of the F1000 racers will use AIM, which makes great stuff. And I've used AIM in the past as well. I've switched over and I use Motec exclusively on this particular race car. So for an example, the ECU itself is a Motec, the M series. So the M150 is what I use. Some of the key attributes for the ECU, it's drive-by-wire. All paddle shift functionality is controlled and embedded within the ECU. It does use high pressure pneumatic air supply for the actuator and shifting the gear lever itself, but it's all controlled by the ECU. It is a closed loop lambda control, so all fuel management is closed looped, and so it controls fuel mixture and everything else automatically, which is pretty trick. It does have NOx sensor control. And it uses that, just not performance-wise, it's really a protection piece in case there's any detonation concerns, right? The logger I use in this race car is a Motec, it's an L180. It's an embedded logger, pretty trick, very expandable. In the professional grade category, I would say with 1,000 hertz per channel frequency update capability, so it's pretty impressive. On the power side, on power management, I use a Motec, a PDM. It's the PDM 15, and this controls virtually everything on the race car. So there are no relays and kind of old school fuse blocks and that type of thing. Everything to control fuel pump, water pumps, virtually everything else on the race car is controlled by a single solid state device that's all communicating with the ECU and the loggers over CAN, that type of thing. It's pretty trick. From a display point of view, I use the Motec D153 for a CAN-based display. and it actually provides all the driver heads-up detail that I need on the race car itself. And this is all tied together with the Motec i2 Pro software. That's their analysis software. So that's how I blend this all together. Now, I do also have telemetry on this race car. If you've seen previous videos, initially I used the Motec proprietary telemetry solution, and since then I've changed. I have a proprietary Nixon Motorsports version of telemetry. So I feed all of, not all, but the majority of the live data from the race car over the pit wall wirelessly, and so my crew is able to actually monitor and see all the details from the race car as I'm on track. So kind of in the weeds here a little bit, but let me talk about sensors. And I have an abundance of sensors on this car, that is for sure. So everything, again, Motec, but in the sensor side, so from the engine itself, you know, the traditional sensors, of course, right, from, you know, RPM, throttle position, gear position, you got to have your ignition trigger wheels, you know, oil pressure, you know, oil temperatures, let's see what else, water temperatures, fuel pressures, air temperatures. I think that's it. The bulk of, you know, your standard engine parameters. Of course, being that I am closed loop fuel management, I have to have O2 sensors, so I have lambda sensors as well on the exhaust system for fuel management as well, okay? I have a lot of other sensors. Now, again, this is not a requirement for anything Formula 1000, but I wanted to give you a lot of the detail of this particular race car. So I use a 10 hertz precision GPS, one of the Motec version GPS sensors. So I have a little more granularity in on-track performance through the GPS. I measure water pressure, which is a great sensor to have, by the way, in case you ever have a water system failure. I have a track surface temp sensor. I have laser ride height sensors, and let me just pan down. I'll just show you one here really quick. As I pan down here, you can see, as I point to it, here's one laser ride height sensor. And I actually have three, so I have one on each side in the rear, and then I have one up front on the race car. So I have three of those. I have shock dampener potentiometers, and I'll show you those here in a minute. But you know, a lot of people do that, and it's a great way, inexpensive way to calculate your load on each corner and suspension travel. But the shock dampeners each have their own linear potentiometer. I also have load cells on the car, so let me pan down here and show you what that looks like. So load cells are physically attached to your push rods, and here's one on the right rear. And those provide very accurate ways of measuring physical corner weights and load, calculating downforce, that type of thing on the race car. Each wheel has their own wheel speeds, so GPS does give you speed, I agree, but with each corner, in fact, not sure if I can show you or not. Well, if I pan down right here where my finger's pointing, there's a small sensor here that goes down to this shaft. Here's the drive shaft and one of the tripod mounts, and I'm not sure if you can see that little piece where my finger's pointing. That's a small magnet, so as it passes by that trigger, it will actually measure speed. So I have wheel speed on each corner. I also have a very accurate or precision accelerometer gyrometer on the race car. So it's positioned at center mass, at the center of gravity roughly of the race car, and it's what I use instead of the logger accelerometer for understanding chassis roll and forces on the race car itself. I have a lot of sensors on tire. I find that's actually very, very valuable. So I have two 16-channel sensors per corner. So let me pan down here and show you. So the very first sensor I have is an external sensor. And this is a 16-channel. It spans across the entire width of the tire, and it's measuring the outside tire temperature itself. And then I have a 16-channel temperature sensor with air pressure, so TPMS sort of like, inside each wheel of the race car. So those sensors outside of tire pressure, of course, give me the inside carcass temperature across the entire width of the tire, okay? So those are Weitrick. The last thing that comes to mind, and I probably have missed a couple cents. Oh, here's one more. So track surface temperature I have on the race car. And you might wonder, well, why do that? Well, it's a beauty to have that logged so you know exactly what the temperature, surface temp is when you're on track at every time. So I do that. I also measure fuel temperature. And you might wonder why many racers, I don't think, do that. As fuel pressure increases in temperature, you know, performance could come down if it got into extreme high conditions. It's understanding what that fuel temperature is at all times. And the last thing, I have a 4G hotspot in the race car. So this particular race car actually has its own 4G internet connection. It allows me to broadcast, but it also allows me to seamlessly or wirelessly connect to the race car without having to connect into the race car with a hard line. Okay, so I think that's about it on the electronic discussion. So the F1000 has to have a motorcycle engine, and it cannot be bigger than 1,000 cc's, right? So there are many engines out there, of course. What I've found in at least racing in the F1000 US series, the predominant engines have been Suzuki and Kawasaki. And in fact, my race car originally came with a Kawasaki motor, a Suzuki motor originally. And in fact, Store used to sell all of their race cars with the Suzuki engine in them at that point. But since I've converted mine to a Kawasaki, so I run the ZX-10R motor, and a lot more racers seem to be doing that today. I've heard of a couple racers out there with BMW. I've never heard anyone with a Honda, but look, again, I'm sure there are. But I run a ZX-10R motor. So let me talk about that a little bit. And currently my engine is a 2021. I've ran ZX-10R motors from 2016 forward. So I've had and have actually even up to a 2022 motor at this point. So they're inline 4-cylinder. They are double overhead cam, 16 valves per cylinder. They're actually 998 cc's, just a fraction under 1,000. And 76 millimeter bore by 55 millimeter stroke. So very short stroke, very large bore. These engines rev to over 14,000 RPM. So pretty impressive motors. The stock compression ratio for the ZX-10R motor is 13:1. Mine's increased a little bit more than that with some deck clearance and gasket spacing, that type of thing. 47 millimeter throttle bodies and dual injector per cylinder, by the way, if you didn't know that. And it has a built-in 6-speed gearbox, right? So, it's actually a pretty impressive motor. Now, with my package, with my headers, with my setup, We get about 223 horse on the engine dyno at 14,000 RPM. And these engines do have, if you look at the air intake here on the top of, here's where the driver sits, right above the driver head. This air intake does have a feed directly into the pendulum where the injectors and the air box is. And that ram air effect at speed when you're doing 100 plus, 130 some odd miles an hour or more, does help you with air volume and does increase your horsepower to a degree. I don't know what that number is. I just wanted to make that point. So the next couple items on the engine, so I mentioned headers with exhaust briefly. So I use Voodoo headers today exclusively. They're stainless 4-into-1 headers. And then I use BRD, their dry sump system. So that is a modification to the motor. It has 2 scavenge ports, and it actually helps with vacuum in your engine itself. And it provides reliable, strong oil supply, of course, which you need when you have a race car that's doing 3 Gs in corners and 3 Gs in braking, that type of thing. I run, and you have some variation in rules, depends on venue, but I run typically 100 octane unleaded. I do not run leaded. There's no advantage in doing so. So I run 100 octane unleaded race fuel, and I have zero issues with any detonation concerns and so on. So how about we do this? Let me get the race car up off the ground. Let me get some of the body panels off the race car so we can walk around and I'll show and talk about the different pieces on the race car. I think that would be useful. Let's do that. So let's talk about drivetrain on this Formula 1000. So it is a motorcycle engine. It does use a chain. So you have a counter sprocket to a larger sprocket in the rear of the race car. This is a 430 chain itself, and it has what's called a chain-driven differential. So inside here, which you can't really see underneath the shocks, there is, let me go on the other side here, there is a Qualf design differential, and here you can see one side of it, barely see inside there. But that's the diff inside here. Now the diff does have a little adjustability. It has what's called preload washers. It's nothing you can do on the fly, but you can adjust the preload slightly in the differential. On drivetrain then from there, you have axles that drive the rear tires, of course. This is a tripod design. And so your typical axle slides in with the 3-ball bearings inside the tripod housing itself. That's about it on the drivetrain itself. Now, as we look at the bodywork here, as I slowly take it apart, just to call out a couple points. So from the front of the car, looking, this is on the driver's right, you have an air inlet here on the driver's right side of the race car. And if I roll over to the other side, you'll see where I point to it down there, another one. I'll go to it in a second. On this side of the race car, air is brought in through this side pod into the oil cooler that's mounted here, okay? If I roll over to driver's left, this side pod also has an air inlet. Now, this side actually has, again, you'll see it in a second, a radiator for the water, the cooling system inside here. So the radiators actually bring in air and then extract the air out of the back side of the side pods and rolls up through the back of the race car, okay? So on bodywork, wings and panels, the front of the race car has, again, this crash structure, the nose, and then you have your wings as well. So here's what's called the main plane of the front wing, And here I have flaps that are adjustable. And so there are the flaps and then end plates here where there's a little bit of vortices that are created here on the front wing itself, okay? And then as I roll back to the car, the back of the car, again, bodywork focused here for the moment. Here you can see the floor itself, and you see these little guys. These are called tire kickers. All they do is help direct air up and over the rear tires themselves. If you think about it, this is a big sail being pushed down through the air, right? So that helps move air a little more effectively over the rear of the race car. And then focus towards the rear wing itself. It is a dual element. You can see you have your lower main wing here that is adjustable, and then your upper wing has actually two elements as well, so they are both adjustable. You can adjust the angles on both of these. You can change the angle on the upper second element as well through the rear wing itself, okay? Now, the F1000 cannot have tunnels. It's not a ground effect car. It has a flat bottom, but it does have a diffuser. And as I pan down here, if you can see this, it's a little easier, I think, when the car's sitting on the ground, but you can see there's this diffuser in the bottom or the back side of the race car. If I look here at the top and go this way, you can see here through the rear end of the car, you can see some of the curvature here. This is the actual diffuser towards the rear of the race car. So as I look with this side pod off, driver's right, you can see here is the oil cooler for the engine itself. Now, I also use an external oil filter itself, and that's all this is. So this is plumbed from the engine. This is the high pressure side of the oil system, and this is what filters and then cools, okay? So as I look at the engine in the race car, let me walk around and just point out a few things for you. So this is a ZX10R motor. This is a 2021 motor. And here you can see the headers and the Voodoo headers, the 4-into-1 header, and it has a small silencer on it itself. Now the entire exhaust system, you can see it's got some material on here. This is called Nixon. It's a special alloy. It is a not wrapped actually per se, but it's a custom built shield of Nixon for the header itself, and it extracts heat out of the engine bay. So that's what this is. Here, just behind that, you can also see it's called a heat blanket between the engine and the exhaust. Again, just from a heat management point of view, that's all that is. If I back up here, these are the two lambda sensors for closed loop fuel control, pretty trick. And outside of the tons of wiring and so on, if I scroll to the top, this big gold looking box, this is just a heat barrier material. This is the air box itself. So air inlet, it's got the ram air inlet. It has temperature, air temp control here in the top, different points of the air box, and that's all this is. So there is 4 injectors inside the air box. There are 4 injectors in the throttle bodies themselves directly. You might wonder what this is. It's simply a small hydraulic cylinder. I use this to actually provide clutch access from my pedals directly, and that's all this is. It's special mount for that purpose. As I span around here the back, actually pause here just for a minute. This is a dry sump motor. This is the dry sump oil tank itself. So this line here is nothing more than a breather. This large 12 AN line here is oil supply from the scavenge pump back into the tank itself. So let's roll over here on this side of the motor and talk about a few other things that I might be able to point out. So gearbox is inside the bike engines. We do not touch those. That is the actual gearbox for the engine. Being that it is chain drive, you have a sprocket, typical bike application, a drive sprocket, and then the rear sprocket. But to shift, it is controlled by the ECU. I have a pressurized, it's called a pneumatic actuator. This actuator controls your J-arm on the gearbox. So through the paddle shifts on the steering wheel, you can actually upshift and downshift the engine directly. I remove my thermostat in the engine itself and simply put an external thermostat here. That's all this is. I like the bypass mode that it does. It works quite well. This is nothing more than the rectifier for the electronic system, the charge system itself. This is OEM, it's nothing special. That actually helps provide electricity for the needed consumption of the engine, right? This is an electric water pump. And being that not quite sure if you can see it down there, probably not where my fingers are sort of pointing. This dry sump actually has a pump that mounts to where the water pump housing or water pump was. And so you cannot use a mechanical stock water pump. You have to use electric. And so that's all this is. This is a electric water pump for the cooling system itself. As I roll forward to this side, you can see the the water cooler, the radiator for the engine. Fits nice and tidy. It's pretty good size. This actually provides easy access and easy control for keeping the engine cool, which you need if you run in high temp weather conditions like we do, okay? So that's about it for the engine. As I talk about the shift actuator itself, I should point out these small little guys here. These are pneumatic air valves, so they are electronically controlled valves that open and close air supply. And these valves actually are controlled by the ECU, and they actually control then the air supply to the gear shift actuator. So that's all these things are. So let's look at the dampeners and parts of the suspension here itself. Again, here's the rear. Here's your A-arms, your push rods, and so on. Here are the Olin TTX 40s in the race car. If I push this aside, you can sort of see them. So these dampeners themselves, the same front and rear, they have a lot of adjustability. These dampeners have low speed and high speed settings here. If you take these caps off, you can see you have a small hex screw in there. You can adjust, I think it's 40 increments, both high and low speed, so very, very, very good shocks. Obviously you have your springs on there and so on. So that's what that is. Here you can see sort of, let me go on this side. So in each shock, front and rear, I have a shock dampener that I talked about in electronics a little bit. So that's what this is, to measure the amount of movement within each of the corners. So let me pan over here and show you the third spring, or heave spring, many refer to it. So this is in the front of the race car. This is an adjustable gap, basically, and these pucks here you can change from very firm or compliant or springs even for that matter. But this third spring actually moves with the front sway bar assembly. It does have a position sensor here as well. This gap that I'm pointing to, that gap is what determines when the third spring will kick in. So I use that for the race car for the purpose of managing front ground clearance. Under hard braking is a typical place where the race car may come in contact with the ground, and I try to avoid that. And so I use the third spring simply for that purpose. So I showed you the rear dampeners. Here are the front Olin TTX 40s. Here you can see them mounted in here, and the rockers. So the car does have 1-to-1 ratio rockers, front and rear, which is good. This is just the hotspot itself. This is the precision GPS module. This is a position sensor for the steering assembly and so on, okay? So that's really it here under the covers. Can't quite see it underneath here. There's the Tilton 900 series pedal assembly as well. You know, so I mentioned to you pneumatic air supply for the paddle shift system. So let me show you how and what I use for that. So this is a small carbon fiber tank. It's actually used for paintball applications. This tank is capable of 4,500 psi, and this is what's used in the race car for the air supply. Pretty simple. You fill this externally. One tank like this will give you thousands of shifts, well, hundreds of shifts at least, and that's the easy way to provide air for your pneumatic paddle shift system. So back on suspension, as I talked about the uprights, and then you have your upper and then lower A-arms. Here's the calipers that I use for the brakes. Now, the brakes themselves do have floating rotors, which is good. 4-piston calipers, and that's front and rear of the race car. But this just gives you an up-close view. Again, this is the rear of what an upright and braking caliper and rotor looks like, all right? You know, let me pan down here. I don't think you can see it, but I'm looking at the engine, and if you can see where my finger's pointing, sort of, that actually is the bottom of the oil pan itself. So very, very low profile, which is needed to fit in the race car. And it's a custom pan, of course, but I just wanted to point that out. The stock oil pan for these motors is quite deep and much bigger than that. In fact, let me just show you an example. So here is get into some light. This is a stock oil pan from the ZX-10R motor. Look how deep that is. My hand's busy with a camera, but I'm guessing that's probably, I don't know, what, 5-6 inches plus deep, versus what you can sort of see there in the bottom that's maybe not even an inch at the most. Just wanted to point that out. You know, so on the steering wheel itself, I mentioned the D153 dash here. It's a Motec dash that I've used. This steering wheel assembly I put together with a few different parts, right? The first is the molded grip itself, which really helps when you're in a high G corner, just from your hand, pressure in your hand. The dash is a CAN-based dash that displays from the Motec L180 logger, completely configurable as far as what you want to see and display. And then if you can sort of see, well, there's the paddle. Go over this way. Here are the paddles themselves for shifting, and it's got the Chrontech quick release on it. So that's the steering wheel itself. Now the car does have sway bars front rear. Here's the rear sway bar assembly with rods connecting directly to the rockers themselves, and then you have your sway bar here, and these blades are adjustable. The front has something very similar with the nose on it. I'm not going to show you that, but very similar. So the front and the rear of the race car do have sway bars. You know, so I talked about the store chassis is one of the original pieces of the race car. Much of the race car has been modified and new, upgraded over time. This portion here is part of the front main chassis itself. So you have your bulkhead, you have your rear components here that come down mating to the engine. From there, though, everything to the rear of the car is and has been upgraded. So this section here, where you have your dampeners, your differential mounting points for your A-arms, this section here in this structure is called a spar, and it actually holds and contains everything from the rear wing through the differential and mates up to the back of the engine and to the chassis mounting points directly. So that is what's called the spar. So a couple news items before we wrap up with this video. I will be racing at the US Majors early February, just 2-3 weeks from now, at Circuit of the Americas in Austin, Texas. So for those of you who do not know, that's a very, very nice facility. It's one of the first Formula One purpose-built racetracks here in the United States. And I've been on this track twice before, and you know, I love the facility. I've developed the car a lot since I've been on the track. In fact, I think it was 2018 the last time I've been there. So I'm looking forward to this. There's quite a few Atlantics showing up. And anyway, so I'll bring you along and show you what's going on. It's a 3-day event, and I'm looking forward to that. So that's coming up in just a couple weeks. Yeah, so the, you know, I talked about this before on 1 or 2 videos last year. I'm super excited about this. I just wanted to share with everybody. So we picked October 3rd this year, and so why is that date important? So my wife and I will be going to France. We're going to spend a little bit of time there around that time period later this year. But the item to share with you is I'll be doing a Formula One call it an experience, a test day, whatever you want to call it. I'll be at the Paul Ricard racetrack. It's an all-day event. The morning sessions will be in a Formula 4, so nothing super fast or exciting, but I'll be on the track, you know, just getting familiar with the track and so on. And the afternoon then, I will have a couple sessions in a 2014 Alpine or Formula One race car, proper purpose-built race car, back in the Lotus F1 days, if you recall. So that's one of their cars. And the Alpine F1 team will have crew and engineers there to support and be part of that experience. So I'm so excited about this, I can't wait. But I just wanted to share that that's going to happen this year, and clearly I'll drag you along and share with you that entire experience, okay? All right, well, that's it for this video. I hope I shared with you just some of the specifics, kind of an overview of this F1000 race car. And hopefully that helps answer some of the questions that many of you have asked. But that's it for this video. I appreciate you watching. If you haven't subscribed, consider doing so. I would appreciate that. And but that's it for now. Quite a few videos being worked on, so stay tuned. And until next time, all right? Ciao.